Well, good morning. Pandemic. I'm here and very happy to introduce our 5th session of the Pandemic Honors College Forum. I'm Dean Linda Kuhn of the Honors College, and it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Tricia Starks, who is an expert in the history of medicine, as well as Imperial Russian and Soviet history, gender history. She has won every teaching award imaginable at the University of Arkansas. This fall, she will be offering our signature seminar, Bad Medicine, the history of medicine and its very worst moments, a mainstay of the Honors College at the University of Arkansas. Starks' primary area of expertise is the history of medicine, public health in Russia and the Soviet Union. She's published way too many books. The most recent was published by Cornell just 2 years ago, and that is Smoking Under the Czars, a history of tobacco in Imperial Russia. And now she's finishing up its counterpart volume on the Soviet Union. And I get to get a sneak preview this summer, so I'm very excited. So again, if everybody could keep yourself muted and sort of keep your hands off your computer so we don't have any weird takeovers of the screen, I'm going to turn over everything to Dr. Tricia Starks. Take it away, Trix.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Kuhn. Thank you, Team Honors, for putting this together. This has just been the forums I've listened to thus far. I've just really been excited, and it's so intriguing to see the interconnections between the different presentations. Thank you especially to Dr. Hancox for coordinating all the tech. This is just a great experience for me, and I hope that the students are enjoying it as well. Today, I want to thank the students for letting me share my passion for medical history and for looking at this topic of quarantine and plague. Now, a lot of people are looking to medical history right now. Looking to the past is an instinct that we have when we encounter something new. Seemingly without precedent, especially epidemics, they're almost always new. There are no treatments, there's no vaccines, there's often no way to mitigate them in the medical toolbox. With COVID, we've seen resurrection of many past ideas. Quarantine, a concept from the 14th century. Identify and trace, a concept from the 19th century. Plasma therapies that were first used with typhus in the 1890s are being resurrected. As Professor Hammond showed, Dr. Wu Lian's idea of using masks that emerged with the plague in Manchuria in 1910, also redone. Even promising drugs like remdesivir, which was developed for Ebola, being repurposed and used. We look to the past, but the past is a mixed bag. There's good, there's bad. And today we're going to have a rather instructive look at things that can go wrong. There are very good things, but there are many cautionary things. We've seen bad things resurrected too. Proposals to experiment with vaccines on minorities. We've seen discussions of whose lives are worth saving and whose are not. Proposals to weed out the weak by letting the virus go. And blaming of certain for the virus. Epidemics show us what we don't know, and they reveal our weaknesses, the weaknesses in science, the ambiguities and challenges. The weaknesses also, though, in our society, in our community, in our governance, the problems we have in health provision, difficulties in our laws, problems in health messaging. Health events also hit the most vulnerable in the hardest ways. They hit them economically, socially, physically, and often lethally. Public health measures meet resistance. We have to negotiate with them. We have to have failures and successes. And looking at past failures, we see social consequences to families and communities, economic consequences in the way that the disadvantaged are hit, dangers to minority populations, demonization, blame, the Jewish people blamed for plague, the French blamed for syphilis, the Chinese for cholera. By studying these failures of the past, we look at things plan, which is a corollary of the general public health take. Preparedness is what we do for public health. By looking at the past, we can prepare for those things that can go wrong and hopefully find good ideas. But again, preparedness, being able to know where we're going. And preparedness in public health, really, I've kind of put together my presentation today. I was really inspired by Dr. Thomas's lecture on Monday. And while I had said quarantine as my presentation title, I meant it in the use as common parlance. People joke about quarantine lifestyles, about their quarantinis that they drink, but even as they are really living a largely voluntary style social distancing life. We're going to go with this larger meaning of quarantine and look at how it reflects in these public health measures and the history of the public health measures that have helped to quarantine or bring in the disease, box it in, as Dr. Thomas said. We're going to follow 4 techniques: testing, isolation, finding, and quarantine through 4 major disease outbreaks. We're going to look at quarantine and plague. We're going to look at find and cholera. We're going to look at test in the history of typhoid and isolate in the history of influenza in 1918. With each one, I'm going to try and balance the information with evolution of medical science, state, interest, and public health, and end with results of the problems, even the occasional successes that we see with each one of these episodes. Wait for the thunder to end. This is largely going to be told through the Western medical tradition. The case studies after plague are going to be focused on the United States. Now, there are all sorts of medical traditions out there. There are lots of different experiences of the plague, but I needed to narrow this down, and I wanted to narrow it in a way that was most reflective of our experiences that we're having today in the US. Along the way, I've got book suggestions and ideas for further reading. Those are going to appear in little pink boxes throughout the presentation. And the honors blog is going to have links to those for shorter options and shorter article options if you're interested. I'm very happy to talk with people over email if they have questions or are things that they're interested in seeing later. Let's see. So as we've been talking, the companion to development of human society is disease. There's an idea that plagues and peoples, why William McNeill really makes evident in a larger framework. But we're talking about it here in terms of just this settled agriculture that brings 2 points of change. Domesticated animals, which are reservoirs of zoonotic disease, as Dr. Thomas and Rothfeld talked about yesterday, that these can be bacterial, fungal, parasites, protozoa, prions, or virus. From canines, we get measles. From cowpox, we get smallpox. Poultry gives us H5N1. Civets maybe gave us SARS. Pigs gave us H1N1. Camels, MERS, all different ways that domestic animals have transferred disease into humans. Population density, which also comes with settled agriculture, allows for larger populations to sustain these viral diseases and create buildups of feces and refuse that can transfer other diseases. Bacterial infections like cholera or typhoid fever, which are fecal oral transfer, all of these things come from the civilization, the outgrowths of civilization's development. And these things foster further disease, exacerbated by war, by poverty, by famine, by natural disaster, and transferred through trade, through war, through expansion. Technology brings help, but also brings its own dangers. Technology and increased speed of trade and travel exacerbates spread, just as we saw in Vice Chancellor Swee and Dr. Rothfeld's presentations. Civilization also brings a written history of our first practitioners of the healing arts. Some of these are from the Egyptians, but the first accounts of plague in Western medicine come to us from the Greeks. In fact, the word for plague comes from the Greek plaga, strike, or Latin wound, and it's a term that we've seen used biblically. But there's no standardization of what that disease means. The first plague account comes from Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War of 431 BCE, where we hear accounts of killing about a quarter of the Athenian land army, though it's unclear what disease. And Thucydides says that it changes the course of war. In our chart here that I have up on the screen, we have, they start with the Antonine Plague of 165 AD, a 15-year span where a third to a quarter of the population maybe died, maybe smallpox. And this is a visualization that Dr. Rothfeld used yesterday. And I've also found it really attractive. Gives us this really kind of clean look at what plague was like when they occurred, the visualization of how big of a death count we're looking at. But there are problems with it. She mentioned the inappropriateness of the fuzzy balls for the microbes because, like, well, Black Death, Yersinia pestis does not look like a fuzzy ball. It has a different look. Or coronavirus does not look like that little bitty fuzzy ball it has at the front. But it also brings up some of the things that Dr. Goodman Strauss talked about in terms of visualization of numbers. There are source issues. Even though it shows Black Death, they're big and large and firm looking. Historians are debating whether we have 40 million deaths or 100 million deaths. That's a really firm looking ball of death right there for something that we don't know that well. Let alone going back to the plague of Justinian or the Antonine Plague. Our sources are fragmentary. The Spanish flu, which we'll talk about the problems of the naming of the Spanish flu in a minute, but the Spanish flu. Here again, we have differences of how many are dead. Numbers are taken from either the predicted dead versus the actual, or the same things that we're having with COVID right now. Do you take tested deaths, or do you take the difference in the death tolls that you're expecting versus what you're having? There's a problem of terms. There's a problem of numbers. There's a problem of new and unidentified. That's why we're going to work in our presentation today more on technique. Now, we'll talk about different diseases, but I'm going to take you through techniques that come up with each one of them. And our first technique, our first kind of public health technique we're going to look at is quarantine. And that's the one that you guys had a reading from. I have that over here. Quarantine and plague. Now, the first probable occurrence of plague, bubonic plague, when we talk about plagues, that's what we usually mean, maybe the 6th century. But we're going to see a big uptick of it during the period of the Mongol Empire. At the height of the Mongol Empire, they had control over all of China, most of Russia, and created a very stable environment for travel. Thousands traveling because of the stability, and they're traveling fast. They had post messengers that were capable of traveling 100 miles a day. These travels went through the steppes of Russia, and these grasslands have burrowing rodents that are capable of holding reservoirs of Yersinia pestis, a reservoir of disease, fast traveling people, and then you get the spread of what we will term the Black Death. The Black Death arrives in Europe in 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea dock at Messina in Sicily. Most of the sailors on the ships are already dead. They're ordered out of the harbor, but it's too late. And until the 17th century, plague outbreaks will emerge for about every 20 years. In France, one of every 3 years. A few notable ideas there on the timeline of some of the bigger outbreaks: England, Paris, Russia, Baghdad. Usual transmission is through the flea, and we're looking at around 30 to 60% fatality. The newest estimate is about 50% mortality. Now, this is what I call my WebMD slide. You don't have plague. But immediately in my classes, everyone is very concerned that they have plague and they start to search. Do I have plague? This is what this plague symptoms are. This is what the transmission is. This is what we know now. This is not what they knew then. This is what we know now. So plague. Usually 3 to 6 days after these onset of symptoms, you have death. The bacteria of the plague is not discovered until 1894. Its transmission through fleas is not understood until 1898. The idea of how long it can stay with the flea is something we only just are starting to fully understand. Fleas can survive 80 days without a host, and the bacillus can survive up to 5 weeks in flea feces. So it can stay dormant in trade goods for a long time. There is a discussion right now about whether the rats are a reservoir or whether it was just other domestic animals as they traveled across in caravans, whether it was on camels and such. But there is an ability for this to stay dormant for long amounts of time, and that allows it to travel through trade goods. And the understanding of how it worked was not clear at the time. Now, bubonic is the most common form of the plague. It has a 50 to 70% mortality, but there is also septicemic and pneumonic spread. Septicemic through blood, about 100% mortality. Pneumonic air spread through droplets, also about 100%, almost uniformly fatal. At the time, though, this is not how people understood the transfer of plague. Now, physicians at the time are guided by the concepts of the ancients, guided by those Greeks, by those Romans, and what they had said about disease. They are not guided by autopsies. Autopsies are not allowed. Autopsies are seen as a defiling of the body and stopping it from being able to resurrect in the later time. And so because of religious prohibitions, they're not familiar with the interior of the body. Instead, they rely upon a corpus of medical writings that was brought by the ancients, by Hippocrates, by Galen, by others. And this one depended upon a concept of the body as a balance of 4 different fluids that corresponded to the 4 elements, that corresponded to the 4 seasons, that corresponded to the astronomical world, that corresponded to the observed world. And these 4 humors were phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. They combined within the body, and if kept in balance, kept health. However, if they came out of balance, you lost health. And guided by the Hippocratic dictum, physicians would work towards keeping those humors in balance. They saw also the reason of first doing no harm. And so not really doing major insertions into the body. We do have bleeding. We do have the use of purgatives. That's something that makes you either throw up or poop, the attic or the basement. And also there are attempts to change atmospheres. The use of fires, the use of fragrance, the use of fumigation. Physicians, guided by these concepts of the body and health and confronted by plague, saw the plague as a problem of the atmosphere or perhaps of the alignment of the planets. And so they tried to help with the atmosphere. They tried by fires to burn off the plague. They tried with fragrance to change the atmosphere. They tried to use fumigation, which might have actually helped in some cases. When it came to pustules and stuff, they also tried cauterization, where they would burn them to try and stop the oozing. They didn't have anything in their toolbox to help them deal. And for the most part, physicians were of little use in this period. They were just more of a problem. Faced without a medical reasoning set to help them understand it, people turned to the church and to religion. And some people saw in religion a comfort, an understanding of what was going on. I'm sure we'll have a lot more on this by Dean Kuhn and Professor Jacobs. And so I'm just going to touch on the fact that many people also blamed them, saw them as sinners or scapegoated entire groups. So Jewish people were blamed for plague, and we have lots of horrible pogroms and attacks upon Jewish people for plague. What we're more interested in for today is to look at how municipalities and public health stepped in. Municipalities had to step in because there were so many bodies. The practicality of dealing with mass burials. And so to try and deal with that, to try and deal with the atmospheric problems, we see garbage removal, street cleaning, even some cleaning of rivers and streams. So there are some things that come out helpful, just not necessarily for plague. I mean, these aren't helping with plague, but they are part of a general idea of trying to clean up the atmosphere. And so municipalities step in and start to do some of these things. They start to also put together mass removal of corpses and mass burials. But many of their programs are much more about immobility and trying to stop movement of peoples. And that's where quarantine comes in. Quarantines are used in subsequent attacks of plague to stop movement. That's where we get the 40-day quarantine standard, is this idea of a public approved stopping of movement, and stemming from, though, a long tradition of ostracism of especially lepers for their disease. It was a way to express fear and loathing of the disease. It was not terribly effective since they didn't spread, but for the public who wanted something done, and for municipalities that were being pressured and governments being pressured to do something, a quarantine was doing something. And it did satisfy for many people their need to feel security and protection. But it's double-edged. It creates security for some, but it creates anger and anxiety for many others. Many want to flee the disease, and they will see it, quarantine, as a threat of its own. Quarantine, institutionalized, even if ineffective, made it through much of Europe. It's widely imitated. Trading ports start its use in the 15th century. Ships that were suspected of plague are to remain in a secluded spot, anchored for 40 days, hence our quarantine, but not always enforced. And you can't enforce it on the rats, and they can climb and they can get out. And the fleas and the goods, they don't stay there for, weeks and weeks. That's also not going to. But the idea holds on until the 19th century, and we have other ideas of how you communicate disease. Quarantine, though, is not just for ships. It's not just for traders. In cities as well, throughout Europe, to differing degrees, in cities we'll also see quarantining of houses and peoples. Isolated in houses, the ill are gathered and put together with their families, all of them walled up together, basically left to die out. It was a mass death sentence. In other cases, the ill is taken from their area and put into a hospital or a leprosaria, again from the lepers, and isolated outside of the city. Their goods are burned. They are given basically a civil death, an idea that they're going to go there to die. These hospitals are not providing therapeutics. They're not providing care. They are providing a place to die that's outside of danger to the rest of the citizens of the city. It's not beneficent. It is frightening. Either of these things, either isolated within your house to die, or taken all of your goods and thrown into a hospital outside of town to die, this is terrifying. And so for most, it doesn't lead to any kind of feeling of comfort. People will hide their illness rather than make it known and have this happen to them. And when they hide their illness, they end up spreading it further. And so this is kind of that double edge of quarantine, that yes, it can bring safety or a feeling of safety, but people then frightened will end up hiding it or fleeing, or both, hiding their disease and running away. And when they do that, they spread it further. And so quarantine has this double edge. And as you can probably guess, the rich people have a better and easier time of hiding it, either fleeing outward and not having to be part of it, or being able to avoid the quarantine altogether. And this is where we see class conflict in the way that these things are put together. The rich could afford to isolate, the poor could not. Boccaccio, who writes about plague in the 14th century in his book, The Decameron, writes of how plague revealed not the best of humanity, but its worst. He writes a series of fictional tales, moral tales about plague, and starts with the proverb, quote, "It is inherently human to show pity to those who are afflicted," unquote. And then he proceeds to show how there is no pity shown to the afflicted, describing ruthless rich on country estates who left the poor and the middle class in the cities to die. And so this concept of how quarantine works, of how plague reveals our worst, of how epidemics do not always reveal the best of humanity, shows up even in these accounts of the 14th century. Now, plague burns out after a rather horrific episode in 1665 in London, which you can read about in Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which is a great, fun primary source if you want to read. We're going to move on to another disease outbreak and another set of public health agendas. If I can get the right button. I'm going to work on FIND and cholera. For cholera, we're going to be largely in the United States in the 19th century, though there are cholera outbreaks everywhere in the world. We're going to use for cholera the story of John Snow, who's considered the father of epidemiology, the father of public health. He was mentioned by Vice Chancellor Swee in his presentation about mapping GI disease. But first, I want to just take a moment to look at this image. Now, we've had throughout our different presentations, we've had people talking about language and imagery and disease, and especially COVID, and how we talk about disease as a war. We talk about waging war, fighting the disease, heroes and victors and everything else. We have within that a rhetoric of disease that has long life. And I'd like to take just a moment to look at this visual that comes from Harper's Weekly in 1885 and was referring to a cholera epidemic in New York. And in it, we see many of the ways that we deal with disease today echoed in the past. Now, you can't perhaps see all of the words on here. At top, you can see this beautiful angel with her wings spread out, a badge of cleanliness as she goes down, and one heck of a weird looking sword as she goes down to a barrier that reads quarantine. And behind that quarantine are these dark, writhing figures. One has cholera labeled on her dress, the other yellow fever, and the third smallpox. And in this, we see a brief contemplation of the idea that health is beauty and cleanliness, and disease is ugliness and filth. And in those images of disease, we see these same ideas about fighting, and the same ideas that have long been held, that health is goodness and disease is evil and sin. Remember the long-standing saying, cleanliness is next to godliness, but also philosophers later talking about how beauty is truth. In these, we have a combined idea of how health is goodness and disease is sin. And we have a tendency from that to blame people who get sick for having done something wrong. Now, this blame can also come into even the people that we're saying are not deserving of the disease, but that at the same time, they don't fight hard enough against it. It's a concept that is really beautifully put forward in an essay by the literator Susan Sontag, where she talks about how illness is a metaphor, and that we use illness to discuss things of good and bad and fighting and all of these things that are wrapped up into that concept. And so if you've been wondering about that discussion of language and war and disease, I really would direct you towards that Susan Sontag essay. And that's my little thing about that one little image. Let's go on, though, and talk more about cholera and about public health more specifically. Though really, we do have to talk about how this is ugliness. This is beauty and ugliness and disease. All right, this is cholera. This is your WebMD cholera. Cholera symptoms, severe diarrhea. It shares characteristics of plague, horrible symptoms, sudden onset, high mortality, 50% of the infected die. But cholera is not very easy to catch. The microorganisms of it, it's carried through poo. And so the fecal oral transmit, it's pretty hard. You have to have a very high load of the microorganisms. Many people will ingest it without harm. The human stomach, or the acid within, often kills the organisms before they reach the intestines. But once it does, it's bad. A sudden, overwhelming attack, dehydration, vomiting, profuse, uncontrolled excrement. Tissues collapse from within the body because of the loss of fluids. The blood coagulates. The skin turns blue, as in this poor Venetian woman, age 23. good and evil, health and beauty. Oh, and your heart, your kidneys fail, often within hours. It is not just frightening in terms of the symptoms, but also the speed. Healthy in the morning, dead by nightfall. Just dead in a pool of your own excrement at nightfall. It is like the ultimate fear of the Victorian. It is not something you see in a Jane Austen novel that they die in there. This is a level of distasteful revelation of your insides that's just really disturbing to the Victorian morality. It's a terrifying disease. Its spread is seen more than anything in terms of a global disease. This is a map from 1831. I'm thinking about Vice Chancellor Swee right here, showing how we start to have a global concern about health. The idea that we're interconnected is starting to emerge within the concepts of how Europeans and how Americans are looking at disease. And this tracks the first major epidemic of cholera, beginning in India in 1817, moving through Afghanistan and Persia, to Russia, to the Baltic, and finally to North America by 1832. Like with the plague, speed of transport helps the movement of the disease. Steam travel and ship eases transfer. And then we have later episodes that move with even greater speed. Cholera outbreaks will occur in the 1840s, again in the 1850s, and 1860s, the 1870s, as late as 1911. And we still have cholera outbreaks that occur in terms of whenever there's a major hurricane or any kind of flooding. We'll often hear about worries of cholera outbreaks or isolated cholera outbreaks because it's so easy to move. But while we have this interconnection, while we have these differences, there's a lot of other differences that are going to change the way that states deal with this disease in the way from what they dealt with it in plague in earlier centuries. States had changed since the 17th centuries. We have rising ideas of capitalism, an ascendancy of the middle class. And increasingly, people are seeing power not in landmass and size of their empire or their country, but in the population and whether it could be brought to labor the land. It's a concept from Adam Smith, from The Wealth of Nations, that wealth lies not in land, but in the labor to work it. And if you want labor to work it, it needs to be healthy labor. You need healthy citizens to work your land. You need healthy citizens to produce goods. And ultimately, you need healthy citizens if you want strong soldiers. And so we start to see countries become interested in analyzing their population, looking at the strength of their population, and concepts of how to make a healthier, bigger population. They start to use statistics to track births, deaths, reproduction, illnesses, and they begin to compare with others. And allowing for this increasing comparison, we start to see increasing interconnectedness that is based upon ideas of health. Now, even with the rise of this middle individualistic capitalism kind of thing going on, there is a real contention about infectious disease, because oftentimes infectious disease brings with it this kind of invasion into the individual's liberties. And new ideologies of public health try to bring that together. So we see the adaptation of John Stuart Mill to fit with the ideologies of John Locke to allow intervention of the state into the liberty of others as necessary for protecting the freedom of all. Not only are concepts of states changing, not only are concepts of the health of the citizen changing, we're also having immense changes in science and medicine by the 19th century. State interest in popular health also meant state investment in medicine. And the greatest investment we see are those that come out of the French Revolution and the French Reconstruction after that. The French create a new system of medical education that is professionalized training, that is very emphasizing of making sure that people understand how disease transfers and moves. And with the French training, you have clinical work within hospitals, eventual training of physicians with hands-on techniques, and lots of autopsies. And as they get contact with the interior of the body, they start to understand disease better. They don't understand or cure it better, but they understand its pathways better. It's maybe not curative, but it is authoritative. And there are some small episodes of prevention that are very successful, such as the triumph over smallpox and the understanding of how to vaccinate for smallpox. Cholera, in its appearance in the early 19th century, is going to rebuke any kind of hubris within medicine, any kind of feeling of pride. Cholera comes with no convincing cure, no good advice on how to avoid it, no good advice on how to even bring any kind of comfort to the victims. It was a return of the plagues of old, of a vengeful God, and many see similar responses. We see people taking flight, we see looking for sinners to blame. Old medicine still held sway. Many thought that it came from miasma or bad air. There is a long kind of tradition of this atmospheric, right, that we saw with the plague, and now it's transferred into a kind of concern not just with bad air, but with filth more generally. There's a group called the miasmatics, there's a group called the sanitarians. They're all worried about the smell of filth, the smell of corruption actually bringing corruption into the body. When you smell corruption outside and you bring it into your body, it also kind of creates corruption within you and starts a chemical process of decomposition. So they saw smell as especially dangerous, filth as especially dangerous. And they start to kind of connect that with their interest in population and this kind of new interest in mapping. And we start to see new and old medicine living side by side. Sir Edwin Chadwick, maps disease across Great Britain in 1842 in his report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population of Great Britain. He saw evidence of disease and poverty and locality, and connected filth in poor areas to disease. Now, this doesn't mean that he was sitting there going, oh, poor people need to be helped and they need to have cleaner environments. They blame the poor people for their environments, not the fact that they're put into situations that are not conducive to health, but that there are prejudices against the poor as being filthy and slovenly out of character, not associated with the economic conditions of around them. However, this kind of coinciding of interest in population, interest in mapping, interest in cleanliness is what we'll see coming together with the medicine, cholera, and John Snow. Now, there's two books over there in the pink, The Strange Case of the Broad Street Pump and The Ghost Map. Both of these are very fun investigations of how John Snow does this mapping of disease. John Snow is a surgeon, an obstetrician, a pioneer in anesthesiology, and he's also going to be the one to figure out that cholera is transmitted by water, not through miasma. In August of 1854, in his neighborhood of Soho, where he lives, a cholera outbreak, it's at Soho, a part of London, a cholera outbreak is going to put his ideas to the test. Hundreds are ill, at least 600 will die. Snow lived and worked in the locality, and he's skeptical of miasma, and he started to use new techniques to try and understand how the disease was moving. He tested his theory that it wasn't miasma. He tested his theory that it was a water source by reviewing death records, interviewing household members, documenting where people got water, and mapping where people died. Not where they died concretely, but where the people that died lived and how they were related. He found that 500 of the fatalities took place within 250 yards of the intersection of Cambridge and Broad Streets, and identified the Broad Street pump as the source of the infection. He presented his findings to the municipality, the pump handle was removed, and the cholera outbreak stopped. It supported his theory. And it supported this kind of what we call shoe leather epidemiology, going out there and finding people with the disease, finding the fatalities, and mapping their progress, who they interacted with, and how they lived their lives to try and find disease. Snow presented his findings to the Medical Society of London, and he was rejected. Nobody believed that this was how cholera was spread. Some believed that no one is not right. Some believed him. Some believed that contaminated water, but the establishment was held sway by the sanitarians. People like Florence Nightingale was a famous sanitarian. People believed that it was a filth-borne disease. It coincided with what they saw. It was the poor people that were dying. Poor people are filthy. Together, these things all fit within the prejudices of the middle class and upper class reformers and medical establishment. Snow presents his findings. He's dismissed. Acceptance will come, but after his death. He dies in 1858 of a stroke, but just before Pasteur in 1860 proved that living organisms caused fermentation. He's followed by Joseph Lister, who applied this to surgery and antisepsis. Koch discovers the tuberculosis bacillus. Then in 1883, Koch discovers cholera, or the Vibrio cholera bacteria. And so bacteriology comes to it, but comes to it after snow. And even then, it's still going to be contentious. Even up into 1918, we have some people that are still using humoral theory. We're going to have people bleeding people in 1918, still using ideas of this humoral, still using ideas of miasma are going forward. There's a lot of blending, but this movement towards bacteriology started by snow and then slowly moving forward through scientific exchange and scientific discovery is going to change our medical understanding of disease. Later research is going to prove snow right, show that there was a cesspit that abutted the well and allowed for the transfer of excrement into the well waters, and that's how cholera was moved. It wasn't great, but anyway, eventually we'll see the acceptance of these ideas. And we do see, as a result of this, an investment in public works, an investment in getting clean water into cities and getting sewage out. And this investment is going to be helpful for all. One of the students, I think, was interested in this idea of, do we have political revolutions or good things that come out of some of these epidemics? And this is definitely a good thing, that we have a move towards making places cleaner and cleaner for everyone. Now, certainly some of this is because cholera showed that even rich people could get poor people diseases, that there was a worry that the poor people are infecting the rich people, and so we have to help the poor so as to stop infecting the rich. It may not come from the best of origins, but eventually we have a good result. We do have better taking care of everyone. However, bacteriology and these discoveries also allow us to have better tracking of disease and better surveillance tools. And these surveillance things, these are tools. Tools can be used for ill, tools can be used for good. Surveillance, though, is practiced largely on the poor to track how the poor endanger the rich. And while sometimes it's followed by aid in the case of public works and better water and sanitation, oftentimes it is not. And when it is not followed by any kind of feeling of aid, this surveillance feels punitive. It feels like something that's an attack. When you put together this idea of bacteriology with the idea of surveillance, one of the things we see is oftentimes attacks upon immigrants and worries about others. And that's what we see in the case of Typhoid Mary. Now, Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary is associated with the disease of typhoid, one of the fearful diseases of the 19th century in America, cholera, yellow fever, and typhoid. Medicine had come a long way. They had identified the bacteria for tuberculosis, for cholera, for diphtheria. In 1891, they found a cure for diphtheria. They ID'd the typhoid bacillus in 1880. Oh, here, yeah, you need your WebMD of typhoid. You don't have typhoid. But if you did, this is what it would be. The typhoid bacillus is identified in 1880. A test developed for the bacteria soon thereafter. Immunization developed in 1911, but there's no treatment until antibiotics, no treatment until the 1940s. It's a fecal oral route, was talked about yesterday. And it led to an emphasis on safe water and food, on good plumbing and sewage, but it also leads to the tragic story of Typhoid Mary. and the idea of the healthy carrier. Now, Typhoid Mary is actually a real person. Her name is Mary MALLON. She was an Irish woman who had come over from Ireland and became a cook employed in the kitchens of wealthy New Yorkers. In 1906, there's an outbreak of typhoid in New York, and a sanitary engineer is employed by one of the families that experienced the outbreak to try and track the source of the outbreak. Usually, sanitary engineers went through and tried to find where the water was that was coming in that was bad. In this case, this sanitary engineer found through shoe leather epidemiology, through find and trace, he found that Mary MALLON, the cook, was responsible for the infection of multiple households and the death of 2. He went to her and tried to get her to give him samples of her blood, her sputum, and her feces, and she resisted. And she's put in an enforced quarantine by the Board of Health. She went to court, got her release in 1909. She had never been sick. She had never felt sick. She did not believe the doctors who said she was sick. She definitely did not believe the doctors that said that she was transferring fecal matter through her cooking to her people. That was dirty, and she was definitely not going to agree that she was like that. So she is pushed into this situation. They release her, but say she can't be a cook again, but she has no other skills. And she didn't believe the doctors, and she eventually goes back to being a cook. In 1915, another typhoid outbreak is connected to her, and she's detained again. In this case, she is committed to North Brother Island, which you see on the map, within sight of the city, but never able to go there. She is kept in isolation for the rest of her life until her death in 1938. Overall, 3 deaths are attributed to her. There's no real law against what she's doing. She's committed to this. She keeps on being tested. She is a healthy carrier of typhoid, meaning she may not have even had ever really a feeling of outbreak, but she continued to shed the virus. It can lodge in your gallbladder. I don't have one anymore. It's over here, I think, or it was over here. It can lodge in your gallbladder, and you can continue to shed it. She never acknowledged that this was true. She never believed what the doctor said, but she was kept in house isolation for the rest of her life. Now, she is the origin of what we call this idea of the healthy carrier or the super spreader, but her treatment is very different than what we see of others who are healthy carriers. By the time of her second incarceration in 1915, there are many known healthy carriers, thousands across the country. Up to 6% of those who recovered from typhoid can continue to spread it. And other identified healthy carriers are not locked up. Even those that cook, even those that have death counts of higher, even those that kill, there's a baker, there's an ice cream guy, none of them are locked up. And one of the books over there, the Judith Walter Levitt, is an amazing story of why, an argument as to why perhaps Typhoid Mary is treated differently than others, and centering on the fact that she's Irish, that she's female, that she's resistant to the medical authorities, that she's resistant to the law, that she lives somewhat more independently than most women at the time. But for whatever case, we have the law applied differently to her. And this is usually used in medical ethics courses, this idea of how far do you go to protect the full? And if you're going to do that, and you're going to go this far as to incarcerate somebody for the rest of their life in isolation and basically keep them from having a family, keep them from having any kind of, regular social life, if you're going to do that, should you perhaps do it to everybody? Or why do you do it to just this one? And so there's a lot of questions that go on with Typhoid Mary, but it is a kind of a logical conclusion of one of these things that we see, this track and trace, this identify, that finding the disease and how do we contain it is going to take us into lots of questions about personal liberty and personal responsibility and state responsibility, and where do those go into conflict? It's one of the things that we're still having discussions about today, that we're seeing that discussions of how far can the state go in terms of protecting others? It is something to think about. Our last case study is the question of isolate in the influenza of 1918. Now, I'm calling it here the influenza of 1918, not the Spanish influenza, and I'll explain that in a second. But on this map, you can see where it actually originates. It doesn't originate in Spain, but up north there in Kansas, just above isolate, is a little dot called Funston. Now, despite being called the Spanish flu, it's likely that the first case of the influenza of 1918 emerged in Haskell County, Kansas, in early 1918. Many of the young men of Haskell County went during their flu outbreak to become recruits at Camp Funston for movement into World War I. It was the second largest training camp in the United States, holding an average of 60,000 recruits. It was exceedingly overcrowded, and it was a cold winter. And so a lot of the recruits are huddled around fires and warm places and exchanging breath very quickly and closely, and they are going to help. Now, there's going to be 3 waves, and I'll talk about the waves here in a minute, but 3 waves of death during this 1918 flu outbreak. A big wave in the spring, a big wave in the fall, and then again in 1919 in the spring. Total sum dead, 50 million, 18 to 20 million in India alone, maybe more, maybe less. Well, maybe not much less, 40 million or so. The death toll in the US is estimated at around 675,000. The ill number was far higher. If you take the equivalent of that death per population to what we would have today, it'd be about a little under 2 million dead if you put the same percentage. It was about a 2.5% mortality. The war aids its spread. Disease movement, of course, is aided by transport. And so the war, it incubates in these camps. 24 of the 36 largest army camps had a spring outbreak, and then they move those guys out. They go into Europe and they take it with them, and then they come back from Europe and bring it back. It aids the movement. The military also does another thing, that the war itself, it also creates a shortage of medical personnel back home, because especially nurses are going into Europe to be part of the war effort, and it leaves us a very strong dearth of medical personnel here. They don't have curatives really that are working for this. They will have some stuff that'll help with secondary infection, but not having medical personnel will lead to greater deaths even without great therapeutics, just because of the care that can go alongside. Mild cases for most people, but in some areas, this first wave has some very strong mortality. For example, in Louisville, Kentucky, there are a larger number of deaths, and one of the worrisome things there is 40% of those deaths are in the age 20 to 35 gradation. Scientists believe that it is transferred by a bacterium. They had found one for TB, they'd found one for cholera, there'd been a cure for syphilis. They were hot for bacteria and looking for bacteria. It's not until the 1930s that they have microscopes that can see something as small as a virus. And there was a medical consensus at the time that influenza was caused by a bacteria called Pfeiffer's bacteria. And so they're all looking for a bacteria that's responsible. And so there's some resistance that's brought by the medical community itself, and the kind of herd mentality that we go around somebody who's got a reputation and they've got an idea, and we all kind of cling to that, but there's some problems with that. Scientists have examined, material from autopsies from the second wave, but we don't have any data for the others. But the speculation from virologists is that the second wave is a mutated form of the same virus. The first wave is in March of 1918. The second wave from September to November, it is highly fatal. Much more complications, much more severe, many more fatal cases in these last 2 waves, in the second and the third wave. In October alone in the US, there are 195,000 deaths in that second wave. The third wave hits in 1919. It hits in some of the nations that have been lost before. So Australia gets hit in the third wave. The second wave is, it's just fast. Second wave could kill a healthy man or woman in 24 hours from first showing symptoms. Overall, we're looking at a 2.5% fatality, but in that second wave, we have some much higher ones, and we also have much higher ones in certain populations. So like the Eskimo population gets hit, and some villages are entirely wiped out. So we're like 100% or 80% mortality. Only the young are spared. So we have these waves, but the waves seem to be caused by the same virus that has mutated and become more virulent rather than a different virus, or rather than some other things that could have happened. One of the things that is most concerning from the, oops, there's my wave slide. So you can see from the wave slide, the 3 pandemic waves and weekly deaths. So early on here, that first wave, can you see my arrow? Second wave, and the third wave. One of the most worrisome things, not just because we were preparing for war, but also because of the way it hit, was what it was called the W curve. Now, the virus itself incubated in soldiers in these training camps in the US. They're crowded, they're cold. They're still moved though. And it's moved with soldiers from Europe to the rest of the world on ships that are basically your Carnival Cruise Line of the 1918 period. The training ship, it's just very bunched up together. They're basically floating coffins, lots of death there. And what we're seeing is a lot of those that died are in the most vigorous years of their health. And that's what's very concerning. We have a usual influenza curve of high mortality in the very young, high mortality in the very old, but then you have this really concerning dip in the middle, the W curve, of higher numbers of those in the 25 to 35-year-olds who are getting sick and dying. There are multiple theories about what happens there. You know, that there was an exposure of older people to a previous virus, but that has problems because of when that would have happened. And but there's also the idea that maybe just because there was definitely this easier exposure and quicker development in military camps, and that there were overwhelming of the facilities there. So there's a surge at the infirmaries and military camps where they're at double capacity, and they're having to put people that are ill in hallways, on verandas, on cots, and make do spaces. And so there is that surge that we worried about here is really happening in those military camps, and probably led to much higher mortality there. In all, though, what are we seeing with the influenza that we can take as understanding for other things that are going on today? First and foremost, the information on the virus is mangled by war and mangled by the press that are under considerations of trying to keep war morale high. Governments are interested in propaganda and have strong strictures on the press. The only place that doesn't is Spain, and it's called the Spanish flu because of that. Not because it originated in Spain, remember it comes from Kansas, but because the Americans were clamping down on full information of it. The Spanish are neutral, they actually talk about it. And so even though it's raging in the US, in the French, and the British militaries, it's only Spain that's talking about it, and therefore it gets labeled as the Spanish influenza. The French, the English, the US newspapers are not allowed to report about it because they were worried it would be seen as a weakness or that it might affect morale. And so Spain becomes the moniker of the disease, which we all know comes with so many great benefits. Not only does war mangle information, the war also slowed government response. Wilson doesn't talk about the disease for the most part. In the UK, they're worried that any kind of quarantine would harm mobilization or might kind of bring down civilian morale. Remember, there's not an armistice until November. In the United States, they deploy the nurses, and then you have a nursing shortage. You have all sorts of ways that the war exacerbates the problem beyond just the fact that we're moving people all over. But one of the results that's most important to what we're talking about today in terms of what we're doing with COVID is the effects of social distancing. Now, there was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that is now, it'll be linked on the blog and you can get it for free, about non-pharmaceutical interventions in US cities. It was put into some really beautiful graphics by the National Geographic magazine, and that's the visual that I have for you there. And that one's also going to be available and linked on the blog. You have to sign up for a National Geographic membership to open it. What they showed, what they looked at was different ways that different municipalities responded, and really showed the effects of having social distancing laws put into place and how that could affect the spread and how that could affect peaks. And the two most instructive are to look at Philadelphia and St. Louis. Now, Philadelphia detects its first case on September 17th of 1918. But the city government is corrupt and ineffective. They want to protect their interests. They don't want to create a panic. They downplay the virus, deny the threat, and they have no preparations. The director of the Philadelphia Department of Health says, as deaths rise, "This disease has about reached its crest. We believe the situation is well in hand. From now on, the disease will decrease." It did not. The only thing he does is launches a campaign against coughing, spitting, and sneezing. 10 days later, he allows to go forward a 200,000 person parade to put forward money for war bonds. The parade itself is 2 miles long, involves all sorts of segments of the population, from Boy Scouts to volunteers. Thousands attend. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was filled. There were pleas for personnel. They were looking for volunteer nurses. Then the doctors and nurses themselves were getting sick. There was not enough. There was not enough even basic care available. Hospitals turned away patients. Families tried to bribe their way in. After the parade, they finally shut down public meetings, church meetings, schools, even funerals, all are prohibited. But it's too late. And you can see that peak is just astonishing. St. Louis, 2 days after their first case, shut down most public gatherings, quarantined victims in their homes, and the cases slowed. It's credited with cutting transmission rates dramatically. Now they relaxed restrictions, and you can see that whoop, where they go right back up, but nowhere near the same kind of peak. It's a dramatic difference. And it's one of the reasons that we've moved towards this idea of socialization in our quarantinees and our quarantine lifestyle. Not only are there these kinds of enforcement, there are also all across the United States more draconian laws. There is an understanding that wearing a mask can stop spread. There is an article in the JAMA in 1918, in August of 1918, talking about how infected individuals, if they have a gauze mask, it slows transmission. And so masks become very de rigueur. But there's also other things that are put forward. In Philadelphia, they start arresting people for spitting. There's one day that they arrest 60 people just for spitting. There are massive fines for coughing in other areas. But some places it gets even worse. In San Francisco, there's a health officer who shot 3 people when one of them refused to wear a mask. And so there was this same resistance and the same kind of worry about how far do you go with enforcement that was going on in the 1918 case as well. Now, I hope you've enjoyed, or at least been interested by, this kind of look into the past and look at these kind of case studies of different types of enforcement, different types of public health measures, and how they have been used or misused or used somewhat effectively, but maybe it needed to be a little bit more conscious of things that could go wrong. I like to think of understanding of past failures as a way to make us more mindful today, but it cannot allow this to make us complacent or unwilling to do anything. Panic and defeatism are the enemies of public health. I'm a Russianist. I'm used to moving forward through adversity, that we must keep on going. And I like to put forward to my classes the idea of the Russian. You hope for the best, you expect the worst. And so we go forward each day with our ideas of public health, hoping for the best, but being mindful that it could get worse and that we need to think about how to mitigate that to the best of our abilities. We need to realize that when we need to look out for biases towards those who are infected, those who are demonized, blamed, considered lesser, to look for the ones that are called weak warriors. We have to worry about what shortcuts we might take to try and mitigate suffering for everyone. There were discussions among certain French doctors of considering using experimental vaccines on Africans and seeing how it worked there, or discussions here in the United States about ration care and what it would, whether the disabled would be the last on the list to get ration care. In discussions of herd immunity, we see echoes of eugenics discussions of the past, valuing of elderly lives as less worth saving, or considering the lives of the immunocompromised as expendable. Dr. Thomas gave the structure to my talk, this idea of these boxing it in, but he also provided a question for consideration of these actions of the past, and a question that I think we should consider as we move forward, how they might influence our perception of the actions. And that is to consider each of these actions, each of these time periods, each of these diseases, each of these moves of public health against the three pillars of healthcare, of autonomy, justice, and beneficence. And to think about whether we are looking for those and taking care of those in each time. And a final note, I just want to say, if you liked this, consider medical humanities. We have a minor now at the University of Arkansas, and it's a great place for you to balance your pre-med information with the uncertainties that we know are also part of being a good medical practitioner. And if you like the history of pandemics more generally, the history department at the University of Arkansas will be offering an online class in the fall on the history of each one of the pandemics I talked about, and a few more besides, with in-depth lectures on each one. So with that, I think I'm just a little bit under time, and I'm ready for questions, Dr. Kuhn.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Starks. I really love how you kept referencing back to all the other lectures that came before, giving our entire pandemic forum a very nice sort of structure. And of course, the medical history is stunningly depressing, but you navigated it so beautifully and gave our audience so many readings that they could look at. So really appreciate that wonderful romp. And yes, the history department will be following up with medical history in the fall. I'm very excited about that. And medical humanities is rocking here at the University of Arkansas, and it is a great ticket to med school.